Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. This is Louisa Wilcox in the Grizzly Beat, and we're here today with Sam Pahola, who worked for 25 years for the Division of Law Enforcement in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, protecting wildlife from poaching and the trafficking in animal parts. Sam is here to share his experience and provide perspectives on the current grizzly bear debate. So welcome, Sam. How did you get interested in wildlife?
Well, a lot of people ask me that. How did I ever get interested in that? And it always takes me back to when I was 10 years old. I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I saved up enough money to get my first set of binoculars and a bird book. And I began studying birds and learning bird calls and the types of birds. And I took a lot of notes. I took the temperature, the wind, the date, the type, just everything. Whenever I'd see a particular bird or number of birds, and then I'd describe their behavior, what they were doing. And I took notes like that for quite a few years, until I was probably about 14 or 15. And that was one part of how I got interested in wildlife. The other part was, today I still keep a life list, and having worked in a wildlife refuge in South Texas after I graduated from New Mexico State in 1981, it was one of the premier areas for bird watching certain times of the year because of the migrants coming up from Mexico into South Texas and eastern species of warblers and all the local birds that were just unique to that area. Things like green jays, chachalacas, green kingfishers, red-billed pigeons. Birds that every birder would just give anything to have on their life list. But aside from the bird watching, my dad would take me mule deer hunting every year. And my dad it was kind of his religious beliefs. He was a Pueblo Indian. I grew up he was from a little reservation south of Albuquerque, Isleta, New Mexico, and in their beliefs, they did that kind of thing. They engaged in that kind of activity, and I became very interested in wildlife from a combination of those two factors, those two interests.
Right.
But the hunting part it was a religious ceremony. It wasn't going out for trophy hunting. And that's how, I guess, if you had to pin it on one thing, pinpoint one particular aspect of it, it would be the birding, because I birded every day that I could, and developed a lifelong interest in birding and studying birds.
Wonderful. So how did you make the choice for a career in wildlife management and then law enforcement?
Well, I have to go back to, and I don't know exactly where it started. I guess my very first law enforcement experience was when I left the military in 1975, and I did some backpacking for a short period of time, and then I couldn't find I could type 90 words a minute, and I took this test, and of course the people said, we've never had anybody come in here and do a 90 word a minute with no errors. For the test. They said, you should be able to get a position at any law firm here in Santa Fe. Well, that never happened. And the only available jobs at the time was at the state penitentiary in Santa Fe, New Mexico State Penitentiary. That had nothing to do with wildlife, but that's how I started my interest in some type of law enforcement career. So the time that I was there was less than a year, but with all that experience behind me, years later, I didn't realize until many years later that work in this penitentiary, working maximum security, death row, and shotgun patrol, and I learned so much from that. To me, I put that experience actually above my degree for the kind of law enforcement work that I did later on with Fish and Wildlife. Because we were around a lot of dangerous people. I mean, I worked there in 1976. In 1980, they had a huge prison riot where the inmates took over that prison, and there were 33 inmates killed there. It's a whole long story, but unfortunately I wasn't there. I was already in college. I was at New Mexico State. But I gravitated towards that. I actually was looking at Colorado State and Humboldt State, which have a great wildlife program. But I thought I would try New Mexico State University. They had a wildlife program there, and I just felt compelled very strongly about going into that field. Initially, I was more interested in doing and conducting research and getting in the research field. But for other reasons that I can't really explain clearly, other than I started thinking the law enforcement program seemed very interesting to me, and I wanted to work for Fish and Wildlife, no matter in what capacity. So my first position actually working with Fish and Wildlife was those 2 wildlife refuges that I mentioned from New Mexico. Bosque del Apache, Las Vegas National Wildlife Refuge. I worked there for 2 6-month periods.
Sam, once you got into the law enforcement work, it sounds like you enjoyed some incredible successes, and maybe you can share a story or 2 about them.
Yes. There was a lot. I had a lot of fun in my career. It was tremendous amount of work, and there were just so many great things that I worked with my colleagues with that I was able to. The 1980s were a really great year for the Division of Law Enforcement, and I had the fortunate experience to work with a gentleman in Long Beach that had a tremendous background in military intelligence. And we fed off of each other. We worked parrot smuggling investigations. We put body wires on people that were involved in the illegal parrot trade. We worked together in tandem with another agent in that office that had a legal background that eventually got a law degree. So there was a number of great successes in those years where he and I worked together. I did the undercover work. He recognized I had the ability to do the undercover work, but he was a great organizer and orchestrator, this fellow, and I had a really great foundation for doing undercover work in large cases. I've always looked at the illegal wildlife trade as a global issue, and being a global issue, you're able to focus on cases that really will have a meaningful impact. But it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to do so.
Well, what does it take to be an effective undercover expert?
Well, you have to be, I have to tell you that I had some great support along the way to do undercover work. I had supervisors that supported me with that. And I'll give you an example. One of the first cases I worked on was back like in 1984, 85. I worked a trophy hunting group out of that were operating out of the main character was operating out of Bakersfield, California, and they were hunting on tribal lands, the Southern Ute Reservation and the Mountain Ute Reservation. And there were reports that the Colorado Division of Wildlife, I believe it was at the time, and California Fish and Game, they were looking at this one guy from Bakersfield. They said, there's no way he can get these huge trophy heads without doing something illegal. So I spent 3 years working on that group. I spent a whole year shooting competition silhouette tournaments. I had another name, had an alias. I had a great cover. I worked for the phone company. I actually hung out with some people that I knew at the phone company. My former wife worked at the phone company, so I knew about everything about the phone company. I had equipment. I was an installer repairman. That was my cover. I had corporate Olympics T-shirts from the phone company because I participated in it. I had coffee mugs. I had keychains. That kind of thing. That was it was a great cover. And if somebody wanted to check on me, well, I had everything covered, and they did. So after the first year, I just got to know who these people were, identify who all the players were, and then for the next 2 years after that, and it wasn't even my case. I was asked to do the undercover work by the case agent who was in Grand Junction, Colorado, and it was another district. So
I guess when you say you really have to get in the frame of mind, it really is like acting. That's all. That's what it is. It's acting, and you either have that ability or you don't.
Right.
Some people have a lot of natural ability to do that. Other people have to develop it. You have to sell it. It's a big sales pitch. You got to believe in what you're doing, but you also have to be meticulous and cover every single minor detail. Every detail to the nth degree. And sometimes I would check my cover to make sure to see if I could break it. Have someone check around to see if they would be able to infiltrate and find out that I wasn't who I said I was.
Right.
So
that never happened to you, that anybody figured out that you were undercover?
Well, they suspected. This group after the second year, they started to look at me because I was the newer person, and I always played the what if game. I know this one particular time in that particular case, somebody threw a newspaper right down in front of my feet at like 3 o'clock in the morning when we're ready to go out on an elk hunt, and they said, "Hey, look at this. Look at the headlines here." And as a matter of what happened is there was a poacher that was related to this one of these guides and outfitters. They were somehow related. Somehow I couldn't remember exactly in what capacity. They might have been a cousin or something, but they were busted by Colorado Division of Wildlife. But they couldn't get the word to me. There was no cell phone technology. Right. So I was out on my own working for days at a time with these people. And there was no backup. So most of the work that I did, undercover work, I did by myself.
Were you worried about your own safety? It sounds really dangerous.
Well, it's there again. Because of the experience that I had working in a penitentiary where there were people that had multiple life sentences, and I was around these people all the time. And generally the people that I worked on with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they're white-collar criminals. For the most part. Every once in a while you come across somebody that crossed over into crimes like rape, robbery, burglary, those kinds of crimes. And there was actually a gentleman that wanted to be my informant that had like 4 or 5 page rap sheet. But I felt comfortable enough to be around someone like that because I spent so much time around people like that. So I know they were trying to manipulate me, so you really have to pay attention when you're around the criminal element to ensure that you never cross that line and you never compromise yourself.
So you've gone undercover with Safari Club International, right?
Yes, I did. And, to really understand Safari Club and the trophy hunting mentality, I got to, like I mentioned, that first case that I worked on involving an illegal guiding operation out of southern Colorado. They had legitimate guiding operation. It was a legitimate guiding operation, but they were doing illegal stuff at the time too, on a side thing. Not all criminals are engaged in illegal activity all the time. They also are engaged in legal, legitimate activities. And when they feel some people they can trust someone and take the shortcut, they'll do so. So I was able to work on a number of Safari Club International cases, and one I actually referred to another district. I had contacts that I developed through Safari Club, and some people were foreign contacts from other, from Zimbabwe, South Africa, those kinds of countries. And there were people that sometimes they said, you know what, you have to look at this person over here. You have to look at this guide and outfitting service over there. And I did so, and I was able to get some relative success for some of the cases. But you really have to spend a lot of time in that circle of people before they can trust you to give you information. And I'll give you one example. There were 5 leopards that were seized in Denver, and I can't remember the exact year, but they were imported from. They were shipped from Africa into Denver, and the permits were they were CITES permits from Zimbabwe, but the leopards were killed in South Africa. They were smuggled over to Zimbabwe, but they had a CITES 1 permit from Zimbabwe that they paid for because the original permits they had expired. They were no good. So they had to get some other permits from somewhere. And the guide, he might have been, I believe he was a South African guide. They got the permits, and they paid $500 per permit. And I had somebody give me all the details of the shipment, everything, of how the whole thing was going to come in, and just people that were in another country were passing this information on to me, and I'm over here. So it was great because, I had like the details of the shipment, and then when the shipment arrived, the wildlife inspectors from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the agents knew what to look for. So in essence, that case, it was a good, successful prosecution.
So Safari Club is a major force in the current debate over the delisting of Yellowstone grizzly bears, the removal of their endangered species protections. And Safari Club has been pushing for this, as other hunting groups have, because of the opportunity to hunt a grizzly bear. Can you share your thoughts on Safari Club's agenda and where you think this might go if they had their way?
Well, it's having been around a number of Safari Club people, I've gone to a lot of conventions over the years, and I've got to listen to a lot of conversations. I've got to know some people. Some people help me, as people that were with Safari Club and have been members for years. They help me to clean up some of the problem areas where there was alleged violations that we had to look into and try and prove a case. But I tell you, the mentality, having been around trophy hunters and gone with them, trophy hunting, not the Safari Club guys in another country, but here in the States, there's a particular type of, when people get involved, for example, in mule deer hunting, there's some people that just have to have the largest. It's not enough just to have a trophy head that's listed in Boone and Crockett. Or Pope and Young. It's for some people, they're fanatic about it. They want to have the very largest, the number one head, And what I see, like, for example, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it would be a very prestigious hunt to be able to hunt grizzly bears from that ecosystem, because it's kind of like, hey, this has never happened. They haven't opened it up before. This is a grizzly from the lower 48. There's a lot of hunters that would pay a lot of money to hunt a grizzly bear in that ecosystem, and simply because of the recognition. It's kind of bragging rights, and it's unfortunate that a lot of times there's kind of all these gray areas of conservation where people decide, well, you know what, we're putting money into the economy here, and many times they do put a lot of money into these economies, but when it comes to the trickle-down theory, where does it go? How much goes to conservation? There's a big debate about it. I know there's been some statistics that debunk a lot of the money in these African countries as where the money goes, how much money actually reaches the people in the village, at the village level, per se. So that's what I see with the grizzly bear thing, the lower 48, to be able to get a grizzly bear from the lower 48. It's just like they had that years ago. They had a polar grizz. Remember that?
Right.
That was an exhibit at one of the Safari Club conventions. It was a big draw. A lot of people wanted to see what a polar grizz looked like.
Right.
People would want to hunt something like that if they were bear hunters. Serious bear hunters.
So, Sam, you worked in the Northern Rockies region and are very familiar with what happens sometimes to grizzly bears, even under endangered species protections, with poaching and whatnot. What do you think might be the consequences of delisting at this point?
Well, I think the thing that really stuck out in my mind is, and it kind of depends how it plays out. Once it's delisted, there's always the opportunity from these private interest groups to come in and buy large tracts of land, force the federal government through Congress to liquidate some of these large tracts of federal lands, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service land, these large areas where they can develop it for oil and gas, fracking, wind power. That's the big one. That's a big pet peeve with me, wind power, because of the $12 billion a year subsidy that taxpayers pay for that.
Right.
I mean, there's so many opportunities where people can see development, or someone could come in, groups of multimillionaires, and they can buy large tracts of land and have a hunting preserve set up, and have something like that. There's just so much. Once a species is delisted, or it's not protected, and one of the big issues that I've seen recently is like, for example, the wolverine. That whole thing with that wolverine that was M56 that found its way to North Dakota, where the guy shot it and posted it on Facebook. But there was no consequences for that. Although, much to my surprise, this cattle rancher contacted somebody about the killing of the wolverine. But there's no consequences for that. You know, it's just, when a species is not protected, I mean, you don't have the education for that species of the protection that it needs. It's just the states, in my opinion, are not always that well equipped to manage something like that, and need the federal government. And I've proven that with the mining industry in Nevada, and the cases that I worked there, and the mining, gold and silver mining industry there. The state was running those. They set up a voluntary reporting system for migratory bird deaths back in the early 1980s. Well, the industry had the impression that as long as they reported the bird deaths and did some proactive work, but they didn't have to do near the amount that they should have been doing, as long as they reported the bird deaths, they were off the hook.
Right.
Well, when we started investigating them back in the 1980s, mid-1980s, we started putting cases together, and we got a federal prosecutor that went after the mining companies. Much to the credit of the mining companies, they cleaned it up because there were consequences.
Right.
And that's the thing. That's the bottom line in wildlife management, wildlife law enforcement. There has to be consequences for these illegal actions. And people just do not have the respect for grizzly bears that they deserve to justify any kind of hunt. They really don't. By and large, people are disrespectful of this magnificent creature, and people take the law in their own hands. It's just the way some types of people operate, and it's just the way some types of individuals feel entitled, and because they feel that the government's not going to do it, well, they're going to take the law in their own hands.
Right. So you worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 25 years and described just earlier that the 80s, when you were doing a lot of this work, was a heyday of law enforcement, and it appears that it's somewhat diminished from what it has been. And a recent survey by the Union of Concerned Scientists showed that over 70% of the employees who worked for the agency and responded to the survey are concerned about the excessive political orientation of today's leaders, who they think are compromising the mission and the effectiveness of the agency. What are your thoughts on the problem, and how would you address it?
Yeah, that is an ongoing, well-documented issue of scientific misconduct. It's been ongoing for a number of years. There's many examples of it that have been investigated by the, through peer public employees for ethical responsibility?
Environmental responsibility.
Environmental responsibility. You got the peer group, and also the Inspector General's office. They've looked into allegations of this kind of misbehavior by high-level officials of scientific misconduct. And when the thing that I see is there's never been, to the best of my knowledge, a director for Fish and Wildlife Service that has a strong scientific research background. I've never seen that.
Yeah, that's right.
The one director that comes in my mind that I see that really has actually taken a stand for the grizzly bears was Jamie Clark recently.
Right.
Former director of Fish and Wildlife. She made a very strong impression with me, and I think with many others, about taking a strong stance to not delist. And I think it speaks volumes but there were so many other people that were in leadership positions years ago. You don't hear anything.
Right.
And I think it boils down to this. A lot of these people are political appointees.
Right.
And they're swayed, swayed by outside forces, outside, special interest groups. And, I have to say one phrase. It's there, and this is the phrase that I've always used, is a lot of these political appointees, they're trading in their professional integrity for political expediency.
Right.
And that's the number one thing that I see is do as I say, don't do as I do.
Right.
And it's blatant. I mean, so some of these cases it's blatant scientific misconduct in the past with other species, not with grizzly bears that I could see, but there's decisions made with grizzly bears in the last delisting that shows that they did ignore the science.
Yes, absolutely.
But people have to weigh in and ask, when you have all these scientists speaking out that are asking, and it was ill-conceived. The delisting was ill-prepared. They didn't consult with the Park Service. They didn't consult with the native tribes, Native American tribes that were involved. They were totally ignored. So it was very poorly executed. And they should have just canceled it right there and gone back to the drawing board and tried for another administration.
Right. Well, they're not done yet. I mean, the final decision is yet to come out, so there may be a change of heart with, hopefully, with the new administration.
We can only hope. I mean, it's you see this over and over again. I've seen it over and over again and it doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat now. There seems to be so much political catering to special interest groups that are not that don't have the best interest of the grizzlies over the long term.
Sam, you're an actor these days. How does your current work dovetail with your previous life as a law enforcement agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
That's, they actually, being an actor is the fun part nowadays, because I don't have to worry about making a mistake that is going to be a costly mistake. And when I was in character in my career, sometimes when I had this persona, I had this other name, I had this other job title, I had to be that person for anywhere from a month to 6 months to 4 years.
Wow.
And be able to turn it off and on. And it was a really full-time acting type position. I mean, you have to sell yourself. You have to you got to pay attention. You have to like these people. You have to come across as being genuine.
Right.
And listening, being a good listener. That's what undercover work that I learned was all about. It's about being a good listener, right, and listening and understanding where the person is coming from. But also, I used to collect intelligence on the people that I would work undercover on, so I'd get to know everything about them before I even met them.
Wow.
And that allowed me to mold myself into a person that I knew they would like. So there's a lot of planning. There's a lot of, I used to memorize license plates all the time. I played memorization games, because you have to remember, when I started doing this work, you couldn't carry a tape recorder for a week and a half out in the woods.
Right.
So you had to take notes. You had to pay attention. You had to write down these notes and hide them where no one else could find them.
Wow.
They don't do that kind of work anymore, It's just, they don't send agents out anymore like that. It's actually kind of a liability to do that in this day and age. But it's the acting part of it. It's very much. I can relate to it so easily, because I started studying acting in 2010, and I took acting courses for like 2 years, and found it to be very much like undercover work. You're getting in a role, but the roles are shorter, and they're more fun.
Right.
And so in May 30th of 2012, I joined SAG-AFTRA.
Uh-huh.
And on April 9th, I had the first opportunity that I really had with my first full-time, my first acting position as a SAG actor.
Huh.
And that was right alongside Al Pacino and the film Stand-Up Guys.
Wow.
And I was a prison guard escorting Al Pacino up to the gate where he met his partner in crime, who was being portrayed by Christopher Walken.
Uh-huh.
And it was at a mothball prison in downtown L.A.
Uh-huh.
And it was actually kind of funny because there were 4 people there that day portraying themselves. You know, we were portraying ourselves as prison guards. And Fisher Stevens, who directed The Cove, asked, you know, he said, well, where's the guy that's the prison guard? And I raised my hand. He says, when were you a prison guard? I said, 1976. Perfect. That's the time frame for this film.
Huh.
So I want you to be able to help our staff make sure that they get the they get the uniforms right, the badges in the right place, the keys are in the right place for the prison.
Uh-huh.
And so I did that. You know, I helped everybody get in uniform. We came back, and then he says, Sam, let me ask you something. When someone gets out of prison, and you worked at this prison where you worked at, this state prison, and somebody was leaving permanently from the prison, would you let them walk up to the gate by themselves, or would you escort them? I said, well, if they've been in prison for over 10 years, I'd escort them up to the gate. And then what? And I said, then I'd shake their hand, and I'd say, good luck. He says, that's what we're going to do? We're going to do it just like that. And so we did. We did a number of takes, and I got to walk alongside Al Pacino, and I learned so much by watching Mr. Pacino for the number of hours that I stood next to him to get that scene.
Why does good law enforcement for wildlife matter?
That's a really good point. And we have to look at wildlife law enforcement in a global way now, because the world is getting smaller, and the exponential growth of wildlife trafficking has been tied recently, and it's probably been longer than we realized, to a number of terrorist groups in the Mideast, such as the Al-Shabaab that are involved in from Somalia, that terrorist group. And there's reports that they're involved in trafficking of ivory, the Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. There's untold thousands of elephants that are being killed for their ivory tusks, and the value of ivory has gone up exponentially. And unfortunately, the European Union is not yet able to ban all ivory trade. And that needs to be explored. They need to pursue that, because the value of ivory now has gone up exponentially. So you have these. The other reason it's important, because these transnational wildlife criminal syndicates are on the move globally and have been for years now. It's a lot more sophisticated now. A lot of these transnational wildlife criminal syndicates have found it to be a very lucrative aspect of garnering illegal monies to fund their particular interests. And because the penalties, it's very difficult. I mean, the penalties, the penalties aren't harsh enough. They really aren't. And in fact, when we investigated many of the wildlife crimes that we investigated here in the States back in the 1980s, we had pretty good penalties then. There was the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which brought about some incredible sweeping changes in the judicial system that took the ability of judges to be able to deviate unless they had a written opinion from certain sentencing guidelines. There was this thing established called sentencing guidelines, where there was a chart, and based on the person's criminal history, there would be so many points added up, and that would determine what kind of sentencing they got. So that dramatically changed things. But at the same time, Fish and Wildlife agents have to compete with cases with the DEA, the FBI, IRS, ATF, for their cases. So when we go to the federal prosecutors that we go to, the U.S. Attorney's Office, we have to be able to sell ourselves, to be able to emphasize why these cases are important enough to justify.
So with grizzly bears, they could be caught up increasingly in this wildlife trafficking problem worldwide, as we're seeing economies in Southeast Asia improve, and so too is the pressure on wildlife parts used in traditional Chinese medicine. And one part of that medicine practice relies on the grizzly bear or bear gallbladder, which can fetch many thousands of dollars on the black market. We've seen the trade in gall increase in the U.S. and Alaska. What do you think could happen if protections were stripped for the grizzly bear in Yellowstone?
It's when you look at the big picture of bears across the world, there's 8 species of bears in the world. And of those 8, 6 are imperiled species, and they're all threatened. The 6 of the 8 are imperiled with and threatened with extinction. And when looking at it from that aspect, when you see those large bears from around the world, those large species of bears that are being impacted to that extent, and much of it is due to, it's a combination of things. But when you start looking at the illegal trafficking in bear parts and bear part products, that's a big unknown. It usually, it's so clandestine. It's very often difficult to detect, and for example, a bear gallbladder, a grizzly bear gallbladder is purported to go for $10,000 or more for a grizzly or a bear, brown bear, on the black market. And the other problem that's compounding that is there are not enough agents, and I don't think there may be one agent in the whole United States right now, maybe 2 with Fish and Wildlife, that is fluent in Mandarin and in Cantonese.
Ah.
So, and no Korean agents that I know of, I could be wrong, but historically we never had a single agent that could speak Mandarin or Cantonese back in the 80s or 90s that could speak it fluently.
You worked in Idaho and worked on cases involving illegal poisoning of wildlife, including raptors. Do you have concern that such activities are still occurring today? And what are your thoughts? Do you have thoughts about what the implications might be for grizzly bears?
Well, I did work up there like once on one particular case that I can say that I worked on up there. And I'd mentioned this before, and it was involving, they were putting out Temic, and they ended up, the animal that was killed was a bald eagle, and it was put out for either coyotes or grizzly bears. Those kinds of cases are very difficult to prove because generally, and this is why it's so important to have grizzlies protected federally. An animal can get poisoned, can go off in the woods and die. And being able to test that animal or test that particular animal, it would have to be a coincidence, or somehow someone comes across it, finds it dead, and the carcass is not sufficiently decomposed to where they can take parts of that and test it.
Right.
And possibly determine the cause of death. But that, then you have to prove who did it. Poisoning cases are very difficult to make. And in Nevada, when I worked in the mining industry, it was easier there because we knew what the poison was. It was cyanide with the mining industry.
Right.
But when you're in public land and large tracts of public land where grizzlies and other animals are about, and if somebody puts out a poison, the poison doesn't determine, what animal is going to be killed, what animal is going to die. So it's
right.
It's a very problematic issue. You really can't put your finger on, well, there's going to be X number of probable poisons. It's a very big unknown.
Right.
And because of that, that's why, and we have a federal forensics wildlife lab up in Ashland, Oregon, that is a premier wildlife lab in the country, in the world, actually. It's like the Scotland Yard of wildlife forensics. And they're able to do a lot of very specific testing up there. The standards are
like Scotland Yard standards. They're above reproach.
Wow.
And many of the states and many foreign countries send samples there for testing for various issues involving wildlife trafficking. They do ballistics testing up there. Another reason to have grizzly bears protected is to make sure that they have the federal nexus that would provide them the highest level of attention if there is indeed a type of poisoning or a shooting. I worry a lot about the indiscriminate shooting. There seems to be a very big propensity for that.
Indeed. It's increasing.
It's increasing, and having worked covertly on some of these rogue poachers, getting inside the mindset of these people, many of them operate very surreptitiously. It takes a great deal of time to catch someone like that, and covert operations are probably the best opportunity to do so. But unfortunately, it takes a great deal of time and commitment to be able to prove something like that, especially if they're kind of so-called lone wolf operators, people that are doing it on their own, but they're not sharing that information with anybody.
All right. So, Sam, after delisting of grizzly bears in Yellowstone, the states will take over the primary authority to manage them, not the federal government. Can you describe the basic differences between the enforcement of federal versus state laws? And do you have concerns about the state's ability to prevent poaching after delisting?
Well, the states have the authority to regulate animals within their borders, and obviously the federal government can regulate wildlife when it comes to animals being killed illegally in one state and transported across state lines. That's why we have the Lacey Act, which was enacted in 1900, which is any kind of underlying state, tribal, federal, or foreign law is used as the predicate for attaching whenever there's an investigation into a wildlife crime. And basically, under the Lacey Act, it's unlawful to import, export, sell, acquire, or purchase any fish or wildlife or plant that are taken, possessed, transported, or sold in violation of U.S. or Indian or tribal law, Indian law or tribal law, or interstate or foreign commerce. And that involves plants, any kind of wildlife product, but it also involves now any kind of illegally logged product of wood coming from some of these foreign countries that are imported into the U.S. That was amended in 2008. There was an special amendment because of the widespread logging, illegal logging in these foreign countries. But the states really do, and the feds really, they need the states, and the states need the feds when it comes to managing the grizzly bears. They really do need each other to be able to do this effectively because of first of all, the limited number of bears that some experts say there's like 700.
Yeah.
Really don't know how many there really are. I mean, everything in biology and science, a lot of these things are highly educated guesstimates, and we need to err on the side of caution and should be more cognizant of really to work hand in hand with the states and not leave the federal government out of it, because when it comes to jurisdiction and being able to prosecute some cases, there are certain cases sometimes where a case is politically charged and states will defer to the federal government to investigate that.
Right.
I personally witnessed this in a number of, well, at least one big game case that comes to mind when I was working in Nevada. And that involved some big game hunters from outside the state. They were in Pennsylvania, and the illegal guide was in Nevada. The state asked me to investigate and help them with it, and it was going to be prosecuted in state court. But under the state, the DA, the district attorneys, the rules in Nevada were you can't record any phone conversation. But under federal law, with the proper case report and submission through the channels, we had to get authority to do that, and the federal government can do that. But for some reason in Nevada, that was prohibited. Couldn't do it under any circumstances. They were going to prosecute these people in state court, but I taped the phone calls anyway because I had a feeling that this was going to be political, and it did turn. For some reason, the district attorney turned the case down, and the state officer I was working with said, "Sorry, we can't prosecute this in state court." There's some underlying reason the district attorney dismissed the case. And I took it to the federal prosecutor, and he said, the federal prosecutor told me, "Sam, you better have recorded these phone calls. I've been reading your reports, and I hope you recorded everything because we need to have good evidence here." Well, I recorded the phone calls anyway because even though the state law said you couldn't record them, I just didn't feel this was going to go into state court, and it didn't. It was dismissed completely, but because I recorded the calls, they took this case and they turned it into a Lacey Act investigation, and they ended up charging the hunters from Pennsylvania that seized these trophy mule deer heads that were taken illegally in Nevada, and they charged the guide and outfitter for running an illegal guiding and outfitting operation without a state license.
Oh, right.
So that predicated the Lacey Act. The guide was involved in violating the Lacey Act because they did not have a state license, so he violated state law, and then we use that as the underlying law to attach the Lacey Act to. But that's why the federal laws are so important. State laws are important as well, but they need to work in tandem with the limited number of bears we have in the world, and with 6 of the most imperiled bear species out of the 8. I mean, why take a chance? The grizzly bears deserve everything that we can possibly do for them.
Sam, thank you so much. This is Louisa Wilcox talking today with Sam Jojola. Thank you.